My book is called Movers and Shakers, Scalawags and Suffragettes, Tales from Bellefontaine Cemetery. And I spent 5 years researching the people of the cemetery, but my research was based upon 60 years of research of 2 employees of the cemetery. They had 10 file drawers full of files this thick with primary sources. Even though I worked on it 8-10 hours a day, I could never have completed this without their wonderful work. It was a gatekeeper and a superintendent, so I'm so appreciative of them. The book contains sections which tell the history of the city of St. Louis. Each section contains biographies. Altogether, there are 80 biographies. So I wrote biographies of people buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery. Some of my favorites are people who changed the world, such as William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, who he changed the way we live, because without the work of Lewis and Clark, the West it would have taken much longer to settle it. They just opened the way. They made it, they made it possible. He had a very important influence on the history of the United States as Superintendent of Indian Affairs, and one that is not so well known. They called him the red-haired chief because he was a masterful negotiator. He brought 419,000 acres of Indian land into the territorial United States without ever raising a musket. It was all negotiations. In fact, he got along so well with the Indians that when we rededicated, many of the Indians came and spoke, representatives of the tribes came and spoke, and one of the Mandan said that there were many red-haired Indians all along the trail. So he left a legacy that way. On his deathbed, he said, "If I am ever damned in the hereafter, it will be for the treaty that he made with the Osage." And he talked them into moving farther west. He gave them $1,800, a plow, and the promise that the U.S. government would protect them from hostile Indians. And he sent them to Oklahoma, which, as you know, is a desert, which was not a good thing. However, there is karma, because they later discovered oil, and the Osage are just fine now. There's also many of the great manufacturers, including one of the really fun ones is Adolphus Busch, who came here from Germany. He actually came from a wealthy family, but he was the 21st of 22 children. So he didn't think he was going to have much of a share of his father's estate. He started out working as a mud clerk on the river, just taking down notes of what came off of the boats, and realized that the Germans in the city had a thirst for beer. So he started a brewer's supply company. Then, because he realized that there were a lot of Germans and they really liked beer. Then he took the time-honored way of getting to the top. He married the boss's daughter. He married Lily Anheuser, whose father, Eberhard, owned a soap factory. But Eberhard had taken back a brewery for a bad debt. And then he did the smartest thing he ever did. He gave that brewery to his son-in-law to manage. He renamed it, was the Columbia Brewery, and he renamed it the Anheuser Brewery. And Adolphus did such a good job that the next year he changed the name to Anheuser-Busch, which he well deserved. He died in his castle on the Rhine in 1913, and the whole city went into mourning. His body was shipped back to be buried, and there was a parade from the brewery right up Broadway to Bellefontaine. He was buried on this spot, but not in this mausoleum. He was buried in the Anheuser Mausoleum. 2 years after his death, his bride, Lily, decided that that mausoleum was not grand enough for her prince, so she had it torn down and moved her parents out back. Hello, Dr. Freud. What do you make of that? And had this commissioned, and it was not completed until 1921. There are also some of my scalawags. Interestingly enough, the scalawags, the worst people, have the best tombs, because they're able to accumulate a pile of cash. So one of our tombs, the Wainwright tomb, is known by art historians as one of the most beautiful tombs, pieces of tomb architecture in America. It was designed by Louis Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright was a draftsman in his office. And Wright said that he said that he was the one who actually designed it. And Royd had no small ego, so if he said that, you know he really liked that too. The actual building itself, the structure, reminds me of Wright. It's a cube with a half circle on the top. It almost looks Moorish, but all the ornamentation is pure Sullivan. And what's really interesting is if you go around it, this is the east side, this is a gourd, so that represents the fall. On the south side are holly berries, stylized holly berries in it, so that is the winter. On the west side are spring flowers, and on the north side are corn, so that's the summer. So you have the 4 seasons all around it. The outside is gorgeous, but the inside is full of mosaics that just will take your breath away. They're so gorgeous. And one of my very favorites is a piece of women's history, and that women's history is often lost, so that took a lot of digging for me to figure out her story. Her name is Eliza Hcraft, and she was the biggest madam in St. Louis during the Civil War, and because there were so many troops stationed here, her business boomed. She became one of the wealthiest people in St. Louis, but she was also very kind and generous. She had been destitute herself when she started out, and that's how she got into her line of business. She never turned anyone away. She gave handouts of clothing, food to all the widows and orphans who came her way. In fact, they lined the streets of the city for her funeral. And when she knew she was going to die, she had cirrhosis of the liver, which is probably an occupational hazard in her line of work. And she came to Bellefontaine Cemetery. She wanted to be buried where her most prominent clients were buried. But the trustees of the cemetery said, "Oh no, we don't want people like you." And then you can tell she was a good businesswoman because she said, "Well, then maybe I'll have to speak to your wives." So they changed their minds. But she is buried in an unmarked grave because they also said she couldn't have a monument. They were afraid there'd be all kinds of people coming to come to her grave. One of the most important graves here, which just has a simple monument, is for William Greenleaf Eliot. He founded Washington University. He came to St. Louis as a missionary for the Unitarian Church in the 1820s because this was the Wild West. This was a place where they needed help. And he said when he came, if I come, I shall remain until I lay my ashes down in the valley of the Mississippi. That's a very poetic way to put it, and perhaps that's foreshadowing the fact that his grandson was T.S. Eliot, who said that my grandfather had a powerful image on his sons and grandsons. His words were like those of Moses. He brought the law down and we could not defy it. And he said the cities on the East Coast were formed for political reasons or religious reasons, but St. Louis was formed for nothing else but to make money. We didn't even have a church until 11 years after the founding of the city. It was for the fur trade, and so he felt that he was offering up an alternative to mammon, which he did indeed through good works, through charity, through education. He's primarily known to us as an educator. He was so progressive, he believed that women should be educated to the same degree as men. They should be educated to as far as they were capable. So in addition to Washington University, he founded a girls' school, a girls' secondary school, so that women could be educated enough so that they would be able to go to university. And this, his friends named Mary Institute. Right next to him is the grave of William Beaumont, who was the first great American medical researcher. And he has such a wonderful story. He was trained as a doctor, but in those days, that meant you were practically sweeping the floors of the doctor's offices. There were only 2 medical schools in the United States. He was an Army doctor. He was stationed in Fort Mackinac, in an island in the Michigan Territory near the Canadian border. And 2 days before his first child was born, before his wife went into labor, a half French, half Native American trapper was shot at point blank range in the stomach. And he thought for sure he would die. In the description, he goes into all the details. Like a portion of his lung, as big as a turkey's egg, was hanging out of the hole. And so all he could do basically was keep it clean. And because in those days, what medicine was, treatment was applying leeches. He never thought that he would survive, but he did, miraculously enough. But when he healed, there was a hole from his stomach to the surface, to the atmosphere. And this is known as a fistula. For 9 years, he took a piece of silken thread, attached a piece of food to it, and lowered food into the trapper's stomach through the hole, and then pulled it out and wrote down his observations on what had happened. And he published his book in 1834 called Observations and Experiments on the Gastric Juices and the Physiology of Digestion, and it revolutionized medicine. It was instantly translated into French, German, and Italian, and was passed all over the world. The cemetery was founded in 1849. It was part of the rural cemetery movement. It was the most progressive form of cemeteries of the day. Before that, people had been buried on family land or in churchyards, but they wanted a better way of memorializing their dead. They wanted to remove them from the city and set them apart to honor them. They were they became the first public parks. It is 314 acres. There are now 87,000 people buried there. It's on beautiful limestone cliffs overlooking the Mississippi River. And in fact, there are even Indian mounds there from the Cahokia civilization, so that for thousands of years, people have realized this beautiful site is a place to honor your dead.